A billionaire's twin babies won't stop screaming on his private jet, driving him to the brink of madness. A humble cleaning crew member's little girl who wasn't even supposed to be there walks up and does something that silences them instantly. He dismisses it as a fluke, but what he discovers about her days later will shatter his entire world. What's the most surprising act of kindness you've ever witnessed from a child? Let us know in the comments, and get ready for a story you won't forget. The sound was a violation. It was a blade of glass scraping against the polished marble of his world. Julian Thorne, a man who had built an empire on the bedrock of absolute control, was being undone by two 7-pound tyrants. His twin babies, Leo and Luna, were screaming, not crying, not fussing, screaming. It was a raw, primal noise that filled the hermetically sealed cabin of his Gulfstream G700, a space otherwise defined by the scent of Italian leather and the whisper of recycled, climate-controlled air. His world was a fortress of order. His schedule was calibrated to the second. His corporation, Thorne Industries, moved with the synchronized perfection of a Swiss watch. He had curated his existence to eliminate variables, to scrub away the messy, unpredictable grit of human emotion. He had built walls so high and so thick that nothing could touch the hollow space where his heart used to be. And yet, here he was, trapped at 37,000 feet with the one chaotic element he had willingly introduced into his life. The twins, conceived via surrogate, were meant to be his legacy. Heirs. A continuation of the Thorne name, they were assets, a project, the next logical step in securing his dynasty. He had not anticipated the noise. "Make it stop," he said, his voice a low growl. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, but at the universe itself. His personal flight attendant, a woman trained to anticipate the whims of the world's most powerful men, flinched. "We've tried everything, Mr. Thorne. A change of diaper, feeding, the pediatrician-approved swaddling." Julian's gray eyes, the color of a gathering storm, flicked towards the bassinets, where the two red-faced infants writhed. He felt nothing paternal, no surge of protective instinct, only a cold, escalating rage at his own powerlessness. He could liquidate a rival company with a single phone call, shift global markets with a press release. But he couldn't command silence from his own flesh and blood. The irony was a bitter pill. The jet began its descent for a scheduled refueling stop in a quiet private airfield in the Midwest. As the aircraft taxied to a halt in a secluded hangar, Julian felt a sliver of relief. Silence, at least for an hour. A cleaning crew was scheduled, a discreet service that would sanitize the cabin while he took a call in the FBO's private lounge. He was about to unbuckle his seatbelt when the cabin door opened, and a woman in a gray jumpsuit stepped inside, her head bowed. She held a bucket of supplies in one hand and clutched the small hand of a little girl with the other. The girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, had wide, curious eyes and 2 braids of dark, coiling hair that bounced on her shoulders. Julian's glare was immediate and arctic. No children. That was the directive. The woman, Maria, froze. Her face, etched with exhaustion, paled. "I am so sorry, sir. My sitter." She canceled at the last minute. "I had no choice. She will be silent. I promise. Serafina, stay right here." The name, Serafina, was a strange, ethereal thing in the sterile environment of the jet. Julian gave a curt, dismissive nod, his jaw tight. He turned his attention back to his tablet, a clear signal that the woman and her child had ceased to exist for him. The twins continued their relentless assault on the cabin's tranquility. While her mother began meticulously wiping down the galley, the little girl, Serafina, stood perfectly still. Her gaze was fixed on the dual sources of the chaos. She seemed not annoyed, but fascinated. Then, as if pulled by an invisible string, she let go of her mother's coat and took a tentative step towards the bassinets. "Serafina, no," Maria hissed, but it was too late. The child moved with an unnerving calm. She slipped past the flight attendant and stood between the two bassinets. Leo's screams were peaking, his tiny body rigid with distress. Luna's were a breathless, gasping wail. Serafina simply watched them for a moment, her small face a mask of profound empathy. Then she began to hum. It was not a known lullaby, not a nursery rhyme Julian had ever heard. It was a simple, haunting melody, a string of just a few notes repeated in a soft, melodic loop. It was a tune that was somehow both melancholic and deeply soothing. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Leo's screams hitched, then ceased. His clenched fists relaxed. His wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto the little girl. A moment later, Luna fell silent, her breath catching in a shuddering sob, before she too turned her gaze to Serafina. The silence that descended upon the cabin was so sudden, so complete, it was deafening. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed in on Julian's ears. He looked up from his tablet, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The flight attendant stood with her mouth agape. Maria looked terrified, as if her daughter had just revealed a dangerous secret. Serafina continued to hum, her eyes never leaving the twins. She reached out a small, hesitant hand and gently touched Leo's cheek. The baby, who had screamed at every other touch, leaned into her fingers with a soft coo. Julian felt a strange, unwelcome tremor deep in his chest. A ghost of a memory, a phantom sensation he couldn't grasp. The melody was familiar. It was like trying to remember the details of a dream years after waking. He pushed the feeling down, burying it under the cold logic that had always served him. It was a fluke, a coincidence. The change in pitch, the novelty of a new person, anything could have triggered it. "That's enough," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. Maria rushed forward and scooped her daughter up. "I am so sorry, sir. She didn't mean to—" "Just get on with your work," Julian interrupted, turning away. He couldn't look at the child. He couldn't look at the eerie calm she had summoned. He retreated to the FBO lounge, immersing himself in the familiar comfort of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition call. He forced the incident from his mind. It was an anomaly, a forgotten data point in an otherwise orderly day. When he reboarded the pristine, silent jet an hour later, the cleaners were gone. The twins were sleeping soundly, a feat none of his highly paid staff had managed. As the plane lifted back into the sky, Julian found himself staring at the empty spot where the little girl had stood. He told himself it meant nothing, but for the first time in 8 years, the walls around his heart felt a little less solid, and deep in the recesses of his memory, a forgotten melody began to play. The melody was a virus. It infected the silent moments of his days and the long, empty hours of his nights. Julian Thorne found himself humming it under his breath in the middle of a hostile board meeting. He heard it in the quiet hum of his limousine's engine as it cut through the city. The simple, haunting loop of notes played over and over in his mind, a relentless echo of that bizarre moment on the jet. 3 days after the flight, he was in his penthouse office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the city he owned. The skyline was a testament to his power, a jagged line of monuments to his ambition. But he wasn't looking at the view. He was staring at the live video feed from the twins' nursery. They were asleep, their breaths a gentle, rhythmic whisper, perfect, silent airs. Yet the peace felt fragile, temporary. The lullaby surfaced again, stronger this time, and with it, a memory finally broke through the surface of his consciousness. He was 22 again. He was not in a penthouse, but in a cramped college dorm room. It was raining outside, a soft, steady rhythm against the window pane. Isabella was there, her head on his chest, her dark curls spilling over his arm. She was humming, the same simple, searching melody, her melody. "What is that?" he had asked. "I don't know," she'd whispered, her voice warm against his skin. "It's just something that's mine, a song for when words aren't enough." The memory struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He shot to his feet, knocking a stack of financial reports to the floor. His breath came in ragged bursts. It couldn't be. It was impossible. No one else in the world knew that tune. It was theirs. It had died with her, Isabella. 8 years. 8 years since the police had knocked on his door. A car crash on a rain-slicked road. Instant, they had said. A closed casket. He had poured his grief into his work, building Thorne Industries into an impregnable fortress, a monument to the only person he had ever truly loved. He had entombed her memory in a vault and thrown away the key. But that little girl on the plane, Serafina, she had the key. The impossibility of it was a roaring in his ears. He was a man who dealt in facts, in data, in absolutes. This was none of those things. This was madness, grief-induced delusion, a coincidence of such astronomical odds that it defied logic. But Julian Thorne had not built his empire by accepting the impossible. He had built it by bending reality to his will. He strode to his desk and jabbed the intercom button. "Davis, my office, now." Seconds later, his head of security entered. Michael Davis was a man as seamless and efficient as Julian's world demanded. Ex-Special Forces, with a face that betrayed no emotion and eyes that missed nothing. He was a loyal, silent instrument of Julian's will. "Sir," Davis said, his voice a low monotone. "The refueling stopped 3 days ago," Julian began, his voice tight, controlled. "The cleaning crew. There was a woman and her daughter." Davis nodded. "I remember, sir. A breach of protocol. I've already terminated our contract with the airfield's third-party vendor." "I don't care about the contract," Julian snapped, pacing the length of the office. "I want you to find them, the mother and the child. Her name is Serafina." Davis's expression remained impassive, but a flicker of confusion crossed his eyes. "May I ask the reason, sir?" "The reason," Julian said, stopping to stare out at the city, "is that a ghost sang my children to sleep. Find her." The hunt began, and for the first time Julian's vast resources seemed to fail him. Davis, a man who could locate a rogue executive in a foreign country within hours, hit a brick wall. The cleaning service was a shell company, a subcontractor for a larger firm that had since declared bankruptcy. The records were a mess. The mother, Maria, had been paid off the books, in cash. There was no Social Security number, no official employment file. It was as if she and her daughter had materialized on his plane and then vanished back into thin air. Days turned into a week. Julian's obsession grew. He neglected his duties at Thorne Industries. His sister, Clara, who served as his COO, noted his distraction with a carefully veiled concern that bordered on suspicion. "Is everything all right, Julian?" she asked one afternoon, her presence in his office an unwelcome intrusion. "You seem distant. The Nakatomi merger is at a critical stage." "I'm handling it," he said, his eyes glued to the screen where Davis's fruitless preliminary reports were displayed. "It's the twins, isn't it?" Clara pressed, her voice smooth as silk. "It's a huge adjustment. Perhaps you need more help, a better nanny." "The nannies are fine," he cut her off. "It's a corporate matter." It was a lie, and they both knew it. This was personal, and the fact that something personal had managed to breach his defenses clearly unnerved her. The lack of progress was maddening. Julian felt an unfamiliar desperation creeping in. He was a man who bought what he wanted, who commanded what he couldn't buy, but he couldn't command the past to give up its secrets. He funneled more money into the search, hiring a team of the best private investigators in the country. He gave them one directive: find the girl with Isabella's lullaby. Finally, after 12 excruciating days, there was a breakthrough. One of the PIs, a tenacious ex-cop, had spent a week painstakingly reviewing grainy CCTV footage from a gas station near the private airfield. He found it, a partial license plate on a rusted 20-year-old sedan. It took another 2 days of cross-referencing databases and DMV records, but they got a match. The car was registered to a Maria Vargas. Her address was a tenement building in the Warren, the city's most blighted and forgotten neighborhood. Davis laid the file on Julian's desk. "We found them, sir. Shall I send a car for them? Bring them here?" Julian stared at the address on the file. This wasn't a corporate matter. It wasn't something he could delegate. This was a ghost he had to face himself. "No," Julian said, his voice low and resolute. "I'm going myself." The Rolls-Royce Phantom was an alien vessel navigating a sea of urban decay. It slid silently through the streets of the Warren, its gleaming black exterior reflecting the peeling paint and boarded-up windows of the surrounding buildings. Julian sat in the back, the supple leather of the seat a stark contrast to the grit and desperation outside his bulletproof window. He was invading a world he had spent his entire life making sure he would never have to inhabit. The contrast was the point. It was a visual representation of the chasm between his life and the life of the child who held a key to his past. He left his driver with the car and entered the tenement building alone. The air inside was thick with the smell of mold and boiled cabbage. The dim hallway light flickered over walls stained with years of neglect. He climbed 3 flights of stairs, his handmade Italian shoes silent on the worn linoleum. He found apartment 3B and knocked. The sound was unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The door opened a few inches, held by a tarnished brass chain. A sliver of Maria Vargas's face appeared. Her eyes widened first in recognition, then in pure, unadulterated fear. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling as she tried to slam the door shut. Julian was faster. He wedged the toe of his expensive shoe into the opening. "We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," she spat, her fear hardening into a desperate defiance. "Leave us alone." "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. He applied steady pressure to the door, and with a groan of stressed wood, the chain lock gave way. He stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. The apartment was tiny, but impeccably clean. A worn sofa was pushed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs against the other. Every surface was scrubbed, every meager possession in its place. It was a home built on a foundation of pride and struggle. And sitting at the table, a crayon in her hand and a piece of paper in front of her, was Serafina. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. There was no fear in her gaze, only a calm, unnerving curiosity. And seeing her properly, not in the dim light of the jet cabin, but here, in the stark reality of her home, was like being stabbed with a shard of ice. It was Isabella's face, not an echo, not a resemblance. It was her face, transplanted onto the small features of a child. The same high cheekbones, the same gentle curve of her lips, the same dark, expressive eyes that could hold a universe of emotion. Julian's carefully constructed composure began to crack, the pieces falling away to reveal the raw, gaping wound beneath. "The lullaby," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He wasn't speaking to Maria anymore. He was speaking to the ghost in the room. "How does she know it?" Maria moved to stand in front of her daughter, a fierce, protective shield. "It's just a song. Get out of my home. You are trespassing." "Don't lie to me," Julian's voice dropped, becoming lethally quiet. "No one on this planet knows that song. No one but me and the woman who wrote it." His eyes scanned the small room, searching for an answer, for anything that would make sense of the madness. And then he saw it. On a small, cluttered bookshelf tucked behind a stack of children's books was a tarnished silver picture frame. He moved towards it, his legs feeling strangely disconnected from his body. Maria made a small noise of protest, but didn't try to stop him. He picked up the frame. The photo was faded, the colors muted by time. It was Isabella. She was sitting on a park bench, her face tilted towards the sun, a radiant smile on her lips. And she was pregnant, unmistakably, heavily pregnant. It was a photograph he had never seen from a time he didn't know existed. The timeline in his head shattered. The car crash. She had just left his apartment after an argument, a stupid, meaningless fight about his obsessive work schedule. He had thought she was just a few weeks pregnant then, a secret they had only just begun to share. But this photo, this was months later. His world tilted, the floor seeming to fall away beneath him. He looked from the photograph of the pregnant Isabella to the little girl with her face. The impossible, insane truth slammed into him. She didn't die in the crash, he choked out, the words tasting like ash. Maria's defiance crumbled, replaced by a wave of grief that seemed to overwhelm her. Tears streamed down her face. She held on, Maria whispered, her voice breaking. She was in a coma for weeks at a small hospital upstate. No ID, just a Jane Doe. She woke up just long enough to give birth, to name her. She looked at Serafina, and then she was gone. Julian stared at the child, his child, the daughter he never knew he had, the last living piece of the only woman he had ever loved. The anger, the confusion, the grief of the past 8 years coalesced into a single sharp point of agony in his chest. "She's mine," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a claim being staked. "Isn't she?" Maria simply nodded, her body racked with sobs. She had been guarding this secret, protecting this child for 7 years. Julian felt the foundations of his empire, his entire life, turn to dust. Everything he had built was a monument to a lie. His legacy wasn't the cold, empty name of Thorne Industries. It was a 7-year-old girl with her mother's eyes, drawing with crayons in a rundown apartment. He looked at Maria, his voice hardening again, the CEO taking over, imposing order on the chaos. "I'm going to need proof. My lawyers will arrange a DNA test immediately." The line had been crossed. There was no going back. The results were delivered in a sealed envelope by a stone-faced courier. Julian sat in his penthouse office, the city lights twinkling like a field of fallen stars below, and stared at the crisp white paper. He had known, of course. From the moment he saw her face, he had known in a place deeper than logic. But this document made it an immutable fact. It was a legal, scientific, undeniable truth. Paternity test results. Julian Thorne, Serafina Vargas. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. His world, which had tilted in that tiny apartment, now shattered completely. The sound of it breaking was silent, internal, but more devastating than any explosion. He was a father. He had a daughter. A living, breathing piece of Isabella was in the world. For 8 years, he had been mourning a ghost while his child grew up in poverty, cared for by a woman who looked at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. He had to see her. Not as an anomaly, not as a mystery to be solved, but as his daughter. He arranged it through his lawyers. He didn't want to go back to that apartment, a place that felt like a shrine to his own failure. He chose neutral ground, a public park near the city center, a place where he would be stripped of his power, where he would be just a man. He arrived early, dismissing his driver and security detail, wanting to do this one thing on his own. He stood by the duck pond, wearing a simple gray sweater and dark trousers, a pathetic attempt to look like a normal person. He felt like an imposter. When Maria and Serafina arrived, they looked as out of place as he felt. Maria's hand was clamped tightly on her daughter's shoulder, her body a rigid line of defiance. Serafina, however, seemed unfazed. She looked at the ducks, at the children on the swings, her eyes taking in everything with a quiet intensity. The silence between the two adults was thick with unspoken accusations and years of pain. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, the words feeling stiff and inadequate. "Your lawyer said we didn't have a choice," Maria replied, her voice flat. He flinched. He deserved that. He deserved all of her anger. He turned his attention to Serafina, kneeling down so he was closer to her level. It was an awkward, unfamiliar movement. "Hello, Serafina," he said. The little girl looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. "You're the sad man from the airplane," she said, not with malice, but as a simple statement of fact. The observation cut through his armor. "Yes," he admitted, his voice softer than he intended, "I suppose I am." He didn't know what to do, what to say. How do you build a bridge across an 8-year chasm of absence? He had brought a gift, a ridiculously expensive doll his assistant had picked out. It sat in its box, a monument to his cluelessness. He didn't offer it. Instead, he just watched her. She broke away from her mother and ran to the edge of the pond, crouching down to watch a family of ducks glide by. He walked over and stood beside her. "Your mother, Isabella," he started, then stopped, the name feeling sacred and painful on his tongue. "She loved ducks. She said they looked so calm on the surface, but underneath they were always paddling like crazy. She said most people were like that." Serafina looked up at him. "Are you like that?" The question was so simple, so direct. It was a child's question, but it carried the weight of a philosopher's inquiry. Was he calm on the surface, paddling furiously underneath? He had built a life that was all surface, a glassy, impenetrable calm. But underneath? Underneath was a frantic, desperate effort to outrun the grief that had been chasing him for 8 years. "Yes," he said, the admission a crack in his facade. "I am." In that moment a fragile connection was forged, a tiny spark of understanding across the divide. He saw a flicker of Isabella's wisdom in his daughter's eyes, an innocent clarity that cut through all his adult complexity. He straightened up and faced Maria. The anger in her eyes was still there, but it was now mingled with a deep, weary sadness. "I can't change the past," Julian said, his voice raw with a sincerity he hadn't felt in years. "I can't undo my ignorance, but I can change her future, your future. I want to provide for you. A new home, a good school for Serafina, anything you need." "We don't need your money," Maria said, her pride a shield. "We've managed just fine." "I know," he said. "You've done an incredible job. You've done what I should have been doing. But she's my daughter. Please, let me be her father." Maria looked from Julian's desperate face to Serafina, who was now trying to coax a squirrel closer with a piece of a leaf. The love for the child was a fierce, burning light in her eyes. Her suspicion of Julian and his world was a palpable force, but so was her desire for Serafina to have more than a life of struggle. "I don't trust you," she said bluntly, "or your world. It will destroy her." "I won't let it," Julian vowed, a sudden powerful wave of protectiveness surging through him. It was the first truly paternal instinct he had ever felt, and it was as fierce and undeniable as a force of nature. "I swear I will not let it." It was not an agreement. It was not forgiveness. But it was a start, a fragile alliance, formed in the shadow of a shared love for a little girl who possessed her mother's eyes and an impossibly old soul. Julian Thorne did not do things by halves. When he decided to let Serafina into his life, he intended to reshape his world around her. The first step was to inform his inner circle. He called a meeting in his private boardroom, a cold, intimidating space on the top floor of Thorne Tower. Present were his top legal counsel, his chief financial officer, and his sister, Clara. Clara Thorne was the only family Julian had left. She was as sleek and polished as the boardroom table, her ambition a sharp driving force that he had always mistaken for loyalty. She had been his rock after Isabella's death, the one who handled the grim details, the one who encouraged him to build his walls higher, to channel his pain into profit. She was his COO, his confidant, his right hand. He laid out the facts with blunt, dispassionate precision: the chance encounter on the jet, the impossible lullaby, the investigation, the photograph, and finally the DNA results, a copy of which he slid across the table. The lawyers and the CFO reacted with stunned professional silence, their minds immediately racing to the legal and financial implications. A secret heir, the line of succession, the potential for scandal. Clara's reaction was different. On the surface, she was the image of shocked, joyful support. She gasped, brought a hand to her mouth, and her eyes welled with perfectly timed tears. Julian, "Oh my God," she breathed, coming around the table to embrace him. "A daughter, a piece of Isabella. This is a miracle." He accepted her hug, stiff and awkward. He wanted to believe her, to share this earth-shattering moment with the one person who had been with him through the darkness. But even in his emotional turmoil, a small, cold part of his brain registered that her embrace was a little too tight, her surprise a little too theatrical. He dismissed it as his own paranoia. "What does this mean?" she asked, pulling back, her face a mask of loving concern. "For the company? For you?" "It means everything is different," he said. "I'm setting up a trust for her. She will be my primary heir. I want you all to make the necessary arrangements. I'm also providing a new home and a stipend for her aunt, Maria Vargas, who has been raising her." He watched Clara's face. For a split second, as he said the words primary heir, a flicker of something cold and hard passed through her eyes before being instantly replaced by a warm smile. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Whatever you need, brother, we will handle everything." But Clara did not handle everything. She began to manipulate it. She saw Serafina not as a miracle, but as a threat. A 7-year-old girl who had, in an instant, displaced her from the position of power she had spent years cultivating. She was no longer the de facto heir to the Thorne Empire. She was secondary, an advisor to the king, not the queen-in-waiting. And it was a demotion she would not accept. Her first move was subtle, a viper striking from the shadows. 2 days after the meeting, a story appeared on the website of a notorious gossip publication. The headline was explosive. "Billionaire Julian Thorne's secret love child. Gold digger stakes her claim." The article was a masterpiece of malicious insinuation. It painted Maria as a conniving opportunist who had hidden the child for years, only to surface now to extort a fortune from the reclusive billionaire. It questioned the timing, the secrecy, and even hinted that the paternity was still in dispute, despite claims of a DNA test. It included grainy long-lens photos of Maria and Serafina outside their dilapidated apartment building, their poverty used as evidence of their lowly, grasping nature. Julian was in his office when Davis brought him the story on a tablet. The rage that filled him was a white-hot inferno. It was a vicious, calculated attack, not just on him, but on a struggling woman and an innocent child. He called Maria immediately. She was already crying, her voice choked with panic and shame. "I told you," she sobbed. "I told you your world would do this. They're calling me. They're saying horrible things. There are cars outside my building. People with cameras." "Maria, listen to me," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "Pack a bag for you and Serafina. Just the essentials. A car will be there in 10 minutes. It will take you somewhere safe." He hung up and began issuing orders with cold, swift fury. He put his entire security and legal team on high alert. He had Davis dispatch a team to extract Maria and Serafina, and another to find the source of the leak. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was not a random reporter digging for dirt. The details were too specific. The narrative was too perfectly crafted to cause maximum damage. The timing was too precise. Someone from inside his own fortress had leaked this. Someone who was in that boardroom. He looked at the photo of Clara on his desk, her smiling face a portrait of supposed devotion. A cold dread began to seep into his veins. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. She was his sister. She had held him as he wept for Isabella. But the viper had struck, and its venom was spreading. The battle for his daughter's future had begun, and the first enemy he had to face was the one he never would have suspected. The media firestorm was relentless. What started as a single, sordid online article erupted into a full-blown international news story. The narrative Clara had so carefully crafted took hold. The grieving billionaire, the long-lost child, the opportunistic guardian. Every major news network ran the story, featuring teary-eyed friends of Isabella who hadn't seen her in a decade, and financial experts who speculated on the future of Thorne Industries. Julian's life, once a private, controlled sanctuary, became a public spectacle. His every move was scrutinized, but his focus was singular: protect Serafina. He moved Maria and his daughter into a secluded penthouse apartment in a building he owned, one with a private elevator and a security detail that rivaled a head of state's. The apartment was a gilded cage, a world of floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, and an unnerving, sterile silence. It was everything Maria had feared. She hated it. She paced the vast living room like a trapped animal, watching the city lights below with a resentful glare. "This isn't a home," she told Julian one evening, her arms crossed tightly. "It's a fortress. Sarah needs to be in a park, not a palace. She needs friends, not bodyguards." "She needs to be safe," Julian countered, his voice strained. The pressure was immense. He was fighting a war on two fronts: a public relations nightmare that was beginning to spook his shareholders, and a private emotional battle to connect with the family he had just found. Serafina was the calm at the center of the hurricane. She seemed oblivious to the chaos swirling around her. She explored the giant apartment with a quiet wonder, discovering the joy of an echo in the empty hallways and the magic of watching tiny cars crawl along the streets far below. But Julian saw the cracks in her composure. He saw her watching her aunt's distress, her small face clouded with a worry no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. Clara, meanwhile, played her part to perfection. She was the loyal sister, the steadfast COO, working tirelessly to manage the corporate fallout. She was a constant presence, offering advice, managing press statements, and expressing deep, sincere sympathy. "It's this Vargas woman, Julian," she said one afternoon, her voice laced with concern as they sat in his office. "She must have tipped off the press herself. It's the classic playbook. Create a media circus to put pressure on you for a bigger settlement." She was planting seeds of doubt, watering them with his own ingrained suspicion of the outside world. He wanted to dismiss her words, but a part of him, the cold, cynical CEO, listened. Maria did hate him. She did resent his wealth. Was it so impossible to believe she might use the press as a weapon? "I don't think she's capable of something so calculated," Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Grief and poverty make people do desperate things," Clara said softly, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You have to be careful who you trust." The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He was being pulled in two directions. His burgeoning, protective love for his daughter and his cautious respect for Maria were at war with a lifetime of cultivated mistrust, a war his own sister was expertly orchestrating. The threats escalated. A custody petition was filed by a supposed concerned citizens group, claiming Maria Vargas was an unstable guardian and that Serafina Thorne should be placed in protective custody until the situation was resolved. The petition was anonymous, but it was funded by a deep-pocketed, untraceable offshore account. It was a legal dagger aimed at the heart of his new family. The move was designed to separate him from Serafina, to isolate Maria and paint her as unfit. Julian's lawyers were confident they could fight it, but the legal battle would be ugly, public, and traumatic for a child already under immense strain. This was no longer just a media leak. This was a sophisticated, multi-pronged attack. This was war, and Julian knew he couldn't fight it effectively until he knew who his real enemy was. He called Davis into his office and closed the door. "Forget the media," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I want to know who is funding that custody petition. I want to know who first leaked the story to the press. And I want you to go back to the beginning, reinvestigate Isabella's accident, the hospital she was taken to, the doctor who signed her death certificate, everything. Someone buried this for 8 years. I want to know who held the shovel." Davis nodded, his expression grim. "I've already started, sir. There are, irregularities." This was the turning point. Julian felt the emotional fog of the past few weeks begin to clear, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity he felt when hunting a rival corporation. He was being played. His love for his daughter and his grief for Isabella were being used as weapons against him. He looked across the city, towards the building where his daughter was sleeping. He had made a promise to Maria, a vow to protect Serafina from his world. Now he realized the threat wasn't coming from the outside world at all. It was coming from inside his own house. The truth, when it came, was not a single revelation, but a series of cold, hard facts that dismantled Julian's life piece by piece. Davis worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency, his team of forensic accountants and investigators digging into the past, following threads of data and money that had been intentionally buried. The first thread led from the gossip publication. The reporter who broke the story had received his anonymous tip from a burner phone, but the tip had been accompanied by a wire transfer to an offshore account. Davis's team followed the money. It was a complex, tangled path, designed to be untraceable, hopping through shell corporations in 3 different countries. But Julian had authorized unlimited resources, and they finally unspooled it. The money originated from a private wealth management fund, a fund whose sole beneficiary was Clara Thorne. Julian stared at the report, his blood turning to ice. It was damning, but it could still be explained away. Perhaps Clara was trying to control the narrative to get ahead of the story. It was ruthless, but not necessarily treasonous. The second thread was the custody petition. The Concerned Citizens Group was a phantom, but the high-powered law firm representing them was very real. They were being paid through another series of offshore accounts. After weeks of painstaking work, Davis's team found the source. It was the same private fund, Clara's fund. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of such profound betrayal that Julian's mind struggled to accept it. The final devastating blow came from the past. Davis's investigator had gone to the small rural town upstate where Isabella had been taken after the crash. The original hospital had closed down years ago, but the investigator tracked down a retired nurse who had been on duty in the emergency room that night. At first, the old woman was terrified, refusing to speak. But faced with the investigator's quiet persistence and a guarantee of protection, she finally broke a silence she had kept for 8 years. Her confession, secretly recorded and sent to Julian, was the sound of his world ending. "A woman came that night," the nurse's voice trembled on the recording. "After the girl, the Jane Doe, was stabilized, a rich woman, elegant. She said she was her sister-in-law. She said the family wanted to handle it privately. She paid the hospital administrator cash, a lot of it, to keep her name off the books, to transfer her to a private clinic she had arranged." The nurse paused, taking a shaky breath. "The girl, Isabella, she was in a coma, but she was alive. The baby was fine. The woman, she told us to tell anyone who asked that the patient had died on the operating table. She gave me an envelope filled with money, enough to pay off my mortgage. She said it was to ensure my silence, to help me forget I ever saw them." Julian stopped the recording. He didn't need to hear any more. He knew who the elegant rich woman was. Clara. It wasn't just a leak. It wasn't just a custody battle. It was 8 years of lies. Clara hadn't just hidden his daughter from him. She had faked Isabella's death. She had let him believe the love of his life had died instantly, letting him drown in a grief she herself had orchestrated. She had watched him suffer, had comforted him, all while knowing that his child was alive, that Isabella had survived, if only for a short while. He understood everything now. The motive was so simple, so monstrous. With Isabella and any potential heir gone, Clara became the closest person to him, the natural successor to the Thorne empire. Serafina's appearance wasn't just a complication. It was the unraveling of an 8-year conspiracy. The rage was a physical sickness. It churned in his stomach, a venomous, black tide of betrayal. He thought of Clara's feigned shock in the boardroom, her comforting hand on his arm, her whispers of suspicion against Maria. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had used his love for Isabella, his grief, and his newfound love for his daughter, as tools for her own ambition. He sat in the silence of his office for a long time, the city lights blurring through the unshed tears of rage in his eyes. The isolated emperor had built his fortress to protect himself from the pain of the outside world. He had never imagined the deepest threat, the most venomous viper, was the one he had welcomed inside the gates. He now had the proof. He had the truth. The only question left was how he would wield it. Clara, sensing the walls closing in, made her final desperate gambit. She had been the primary architect of the Nakatomi merger, a $50 billion deal that would be the crowning achievement of Julian's career, a move that would cement Thorne Industries as the undisputed global leader in its sector. It was his legacy, the culmination of 8 years of relentless, soul-crushing work. She scheduled the final signing ceremony with the Japanese delegation for Friday at 3 p.m. in the main boardroom. It was a meticulously planned media event, a public coronation. Simultaneously, she pulled the trigger on her legal attack. The custody hearing, which Julian's lawyers had been trying to delay, was suddenly fast-tracked by a sympathetic judge. It was scheduled for the same day, the same time, Friday at 3 p.m. The choice was stark, a moral gauntlet designed with surgical cruelty. He could be in his boardroom, signing the deal that defined his empire, securing the legacy he had spent his life building. Or he could be in a sterile downtown courtroom, fighting for the right to be a father to a daughter he had only just met. He could not be in both places. Clara presented him with the schedule on Thursday afternoon, her face a perfect mask of apologetic efficiency. "It's terrible timing, Julian," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The judge is intractable, but don't worry, our legal team is the best in the world. They can handle the hearing. You are needed here. The Nakatomi deal cannot happen without you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since he'd heard the nurse's confession. He saw past the polished exterior, the concerned expression, and saw the cold, calculating ambition beneath. She was watching him, gauging his reaction, confident that the Julian Thorne she had so carefully molded, the man who valued his empire above all else, would make the correct choice. He would choose the deal. He would leave his daughter's fate in the hands of lawyers, and in doing so, he would prove Maria's worst fears correct. That he was a man who would always put business before blood. "The lawyers will handle it," he said, his voice a flat monotone. A flicker of triumph sparked in Clara's eyes. She had won. "Exactly," she said, patting his arm. "You focus on what's important. I'll make sure everything is taken care of. You may stay." That night a storm rolled into the city, mirroring the tempest in Julian's soul. Rain lashed against the windows of his penthouse. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, the evidence Davis had collected laid out on his desk, the financial records, the nurse's recorded testimony, the proof of his sister's monstrous betrayal. He thought about the man he had been just a month ago, a hollow king on a lonely throne. He thought about a little girl on an airplane, humming a forgotten lullaby that had somehow resurrected his heart. He thought about her question in the park, "Are you calm on the surface but paddling like crazy underneath?" He had been paddling his whole life, not to stay afloat, but to outrun his own humanity. The choice Clara had given him was not a choice between his company and his daughter. It was a choice between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. It was a choice between his old empty kingdom and a new one filled with a messy, unpredictable, terrifying love. By dawn, the storm outside had broken, but the one inside Julian had settled into a cold, hard resolve. He knew what he had to do. At 2:45 p.m. on Friday, the Thorne Industries boardroom was buzzing. The Japanese delegation, led by the venerable Mr. Nakatomi himself, was seated at the massive mahogany table. Pens were laid out on blotters next to stacks of contracts worth $50 billion. The media was gathered outside, ready to capture the historic moment. Clara stood at the head of the table, radiant and triumphant. Julian walked in at 2:50 p.m., impeccably dressed, his face an unreadable mask. He took his seat. Clara gave him a subtle, approving nod. At 2:58 p.m., his personal phone, which was never on during meetings, buzzed on the table. It was a text from Maria at the courthouse. "They're calling our case. Where are you?" Julian looked at the message. He looked at the $50 billion contracts. He looked at Mr. Nakatomi, who smiled and gestured for him to sign. He looked at his sister, whose face was alight with victory. Then he stood up. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the stunned silence. "I apologize. This deal is off." He turned and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving a maelstrom of confusion and outrage in his wake. The empire could burn. His real legacy was waiting for him in a courtroom downtown. The marble hallways of the courthouse were a stark, cold contrast to the plush carpets of his office. Julian strode through them, his purpose a burning fire in his chest. He saw Clara first. She was standing outside the courtroom doors, her face a twisted mask of fury and disbelief. Her phone had obviously been blowing up with frantic calls from the boardroom. "What have you done?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "Are you insane? You just destroyed your life's work." "No," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet as he pulled his arm from her grasp. "You tried to destroy my life, my real life." He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the dawning realization that her plan had gone horribly wrong. "I know everything, Clara," he said, each word a hammer blow. "The hospital, the nurse, the private clinic. I know you let me believe she was dead. I know you hid my daughter from me for 8 years. All for this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent courthouse, at the world of power and money she coveted. "All for an empire you were never going to inherit." He didn't wait for her denial. He pushed past her and entered the courtroom. The scene inside was grim. Maria was on the witness stand, being grilled by a sharp-suited lawyer who was twisting her poverty and her past into a weapon against her. Serafina sat on a bench next to Julian's lead attorney, her small legs dangling high above the floor, her face pale and frightened. "Objection!" Julian's voice boomed through the room, startling everyone. The judge, a stern-faced woman, peered down at him over her glasses. "And you are?" "I am Julian Thorne," he said, walking down the aisle. "I am Serafina's father, and this hearing is a farce, predicated on lies and malicious intent, orchestrated by the woman standing in the hallway." He reached the front of the courtroom and stood beside Maria's chair, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, fragile hope. He addressed the judge, his voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a father's righteous anger. "I have evidence," he said, holding up his phone, "a sworn confession and financial records that will prove this entire proceeding is fraudulent." He turned to look at Serafina. Her terrified expression softened as their eyes met. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, a promise that the sad man from the airplane was finally here to fix things. The chaos that followed was swift and decisive. Julian's lawyers presented the evidence to the judge in her chambers. The custody petition was thrown out immediately, with a promise of a full investigation into the law firm that had filed it. When Julian emerged, Clara was gone. She had fled, but there was nowhere for her to run. Davis had already been in touch with the district attorney. Warrants were being issued, her assets were being frozen, her conspiracy had crumbled to dust. Julian didn't waste a moment on her. He walked over to the bench where Serafina was sitting. He knelt before her, just as he had in the park. "It's over," he said softly. "No one is ever going to try and hurt you or your aunt again. I promise." Serafina looked at him, her gaze holding that same preternatural wisdom he'd seen before. Then she did something that broke through the last of his walls. She launched herself off the bench and wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Julian hugged her back, a raw, powerful sob catching in his throat. He held onto his daughter, this impossible, miraculous gift, and for the first time the hollow space in his chest felt full. He looked over her shoulder at Maria, who was watching them with tears streaming down her face. They were tears not of sadness, but of relief. He had walked out on his empire. He had publicly chosen his family. He had confronted the betrayer and vanquished the threat. He had exiled the viper from his life. In the ruins of his old kingdom, standing in a cold courthouse hallway, holding his daughter, he finally felt like a king. 6 months later, the world of Julian Thorne was unrecognizable. The manicured lawns of his sprawling estate, once empty and silent, were now littered with the bright plastic chaos of children's toys. The sound of laughter echoed in hallways that had once known only the whisper of his footsteps. He had walked away from the Nakatomi deal, an act that had sent shockwaves through the financial world. He had then stunned them further by stepping down as CEO of Thorne Industries, promoting a trusted subordinate to the position, and retaining his seat as chairman of the board. He still guided the ship, but he was no longer chained to the helm. His life's work was no longer building an empire of steel and glass, but a home. Clara was gone. After a swift and brutal legal battle, fueled by the mountain of evidence against her, she was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. The media, once obsessed with Julian's secret child, was now consumed by the story of his treacherous sister. She was ruined, exiled not just from his life, but from the society she so desperately wanted to rule. Her name was a synonym for disgrace. The new kingdom Julian was building was small, and its foundations were not concrete, but love. Maria, after much persuasion, had agreed to move into the estate's large guest house. It gave her the independence she needed and the proximity the new family craved. She was no longer just Serafina's guardian. She was a beloved aunt to the twins, Leo and Luna, and a trusted, grounding presence in Julian's life. The suspicion in her eyes had been replaced by a warm, watchful affection. This afternoon, Julian was not in a boardroom. He was on his hands and knees in the grass, pretending to be a monster chasing a giggling Serafina. The twins, now babbling and crawling, were on a blanket nearby, cooed over by Maria. The sun was warm on his back, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Serafina shrieked with delight as he caught her, lifting her high into the air. Her laughter was the most valuable currency he had ever known. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" she yelled. The word, Daddy, still sent a jolt of profound, overwhelming joy through him every time he heard it. It was a title he had never wanted, and now it was the only one that mattered. He set her down, and she immediately ran to the blanket, scooping up one of the twins in a careful, loving hug. He watched her, this preternaturally wise child who had saved him. She had not only silenced his crying babies on a plane, she had silenced the screaming emptiness in his own soul. He walked over and sat on the edge of the blanket, pulling Luna into his lap. The baby grabbed his finger with her tiny, perfect hand. Maria smiled at him, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "You're a natural," she said. "I have a good teacher," he replied, his gaze soft as he looked at Serafina. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Julian stood on the terrace, looking out over the quiet grounds of his estate. Maria came to stand beside him. "Isabella would be so proud of her," Maria said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "She would be proud of you," Julian corrected her gently. "You saved her. You kept her safe. You gave her a life filled with love when I wasn't there to do it." They stood for a moment, two people bound by a shared loss and a shared love. The past was not forgotten, but it was no longer a ghost that haunted them. It was a memory that connected them. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver frame he had taken from Maria's apartment. He had had the photo of Isabella restored. Her smiling, pregnant face was now clear and radiant. "I think this belongs in the main house now," he said, handing it to her, "where everyone can see it." Maria took it, her fingers tracing the image of her sister. "Welcome home, Izzy," she whispered. Julian looked up at the house, no longer just a structure of stone and glass, but a home, filled with light and noise and life. He was no longer the isolated emperor. He was a father, a guardian, a part of a messy, complicated, beautiful family. His new kingdom was complete, and its future was brighter than any skyline he had ever conquered.